The Advancement of Learning by Francis Bacon, Part 1 out of 5. Introduction. The TV books of Francis Bacon, of the Proficience and Advancement of Learning, Divine and Humane, to the King at London, printed 4 Henry tomes, and are to be sold at his shop at Gray's in Newgate in Holborn. 1605. That was the original title page of the book, now in the reader's hand, a living book that led the way to a new world of thought. It was the book in which Bacon, early in the reign of James I, prepared the way for a full setting forth of his new organon, or instrument of knowledge. The organon of Aristotle was a set of treatises in which Aristotle had written the doctrine of propositions. Study of these treatises was a chief occupation of young men when they passed from school to college and proceeded from grammar to logic. The second of the 7 sciences. Francis Bacon, as a youth of 16, at Trinity College, Cambridge, felt the unfruitfulness of this method of search after truth. He was the son of Sir Nicholas Bacon, Queen Elizabeth's Lord Keeper, and was born at York House in the Strand on the 22nd of January, 1561. His mother was the Lord Keeper's second wife, one of 2 sisters, of whom the other married Sir William Cecil. Afterwards Lord Burleigh. Sir Nicholas Bacon had 6 children by his former marriage, and by his second wife 2 sons, Antony and Francis, of whom Antony was about 2 years the elder. The family home was at York Place, and at Gorhambury, near St. Albans, from which town, in its ancient and its modern style, Bacon afterwards took his titles of Verulam and St. Albans. Antony and Francis Bacon went together to Trinity College, Cambridge, when Antony was 14 years old and Francis 12. Francis remained at Cambridge only until his 16th year, and Dr. Raleigh, his chaplain in after years, reports of him that whilst he was comorant in the university, about 16 years of age, as his lordship hath been pleased to impart unto myself, he first fell into dislike of the philosophy of Aristotle, not for the worthlessness of the author, to whom he would ascribe all high attributes, but for the unfruitfulness of the way, being a philosophy, as his lordship used to say, only strong for disputatious and contentions, but barren of the production of works for the benefit of the life of man, in which mind he continued to his dying day. Bacon was sent as a youth of 16 to Paris with the ambassador Sir Amyas Paulet to begin his training for the public service. But his father's death, in February 1579, before he had completed the provision he was making for his youngest children, obliged him to return to London, and at the age of 18 to settle down at Gray's Inn to the study of law as a profession. He was admitted to the outer bar in June 1582, and about that time, at the age of 21, wrote a sketch of his conception of a new organon that should lead man to more fruitful knowledge, in a little Latin tract, which he called Temporis Partus Maximus, the greatest birth of time. In November 1584, Bacon took his seat in the House of Commons as member for Melcombe Regis in Dorsetshire. In October 1586, he sat for Taunton. He was member afterwards for Liverpool, and he was one of those who petitioned for the speedy execution of Mary Queen of Scots. In October 1589, he obtained the reversion of the office of Clerk of the Council in the Star Chamber, which was worth £1,600 or £2,000 a year, but for the succession to this office he had to wait until 1608. It had not yet fallen to him when he wrote his two books of the advancement of learning. In the Parliament that met in February 1593, Bacon sat as member for Middlesex. He raised difficulties of procedure in the way of the grant of a treble subsidy, by just objection to the joining of the Lords with the Commons in a money grant, and a desire to extend the time allowed for payment from 3 years to 6. It was, in fact, extended to 4 years. The Queen was offended. Francis Bacon and his brother Anthony had attached themselves to the young Earl of Essex, who was their friend and patron. The office of Attorney General became vacant. Essex asked the Queen to appoint Francis Bacon. The Queen gave the office to Sir Edward Coke, who was already Solicitor General, and by 9 years Bacon's senior. The office of Solicitor General thus became vacant, and that was sought for Francis Bacon. The Queen, after delay and hesitation, gave it in November 1595 to Sir Jean Fleming. The Earl of Essex consoled his friend by giving him a piece of land Twickenham Park, which Bacon afterwards sold for £1,800 equal, say, to £12,000 in present buying power. In 1597 Bacon was returned to Parliament as member for Ipswich, and in that year he was hoping to marry the rich widow of Sir William Hatton, Essex helping, but the lady married, in the next year, Sir Edward Coke. It was in 1597 that Bacon published the first edition of his essays. That was a little book containing only 10 essays in English, with 12 meditations sacri, which were essays in Latin on religious subjects. From 1597 onward, to the end of his life, Bacon's essays were subject to continuous addition and revision. The author's second edition, in which the number of the essays was increased from 10 to 38, did not appear until November or December 1612, 7 years later than these two books on the advancement of learning, and the final edition of the essays, in which their number was increased from 38 to 58, appeared only in 1625. And Bacon died on the 9th of April, 1626. The edition of the essays published in 1597, under Elizabeth, marked only the beginning of a course of thought that afterwards flowed in one stream with his teachings in philosophy. In February 1601, there was the rebellion of Essex. Francis Bacon had separated himself from his patron after giving him advice that was disregarded. Bacon, now Queen's Counsel, not only appeared against his old friend. Perhaps he hoped to win back the Queen's favour. He twice obtruded violent attacks upon Essex when he was not called upon to speak. On the 25th of February, 1601, Essex was beheaded. The genius of Bacon was next employed to justify that act by a declaration of the practices and treasons attempted and committed by Robert, late Earl of Essex, and his complices. But James of Scotland, on whose behalf Essex had intervened, came to the throne by the death of Elizabeth on the 24th of March, 1603. Bacon was among the crowd of men who were made knights by James I, and he had to justify himself under the new order of things by writing Sir Francis Bacon his apology in certain imputations concerning the late Earl of Essex. He was returned to the first Parliament of James I by Ipswich and St. Albans, and he was confirmed in his office of King's Counsel in August, 1604, but he was not appointed to the office of Solicitor General when it became vacant in that year. That was the position of Francis Bacon in 1605, when he published this work, where in his first book he pointed out the discredits of learning from human defects of the learned, and emptiness of many of the studies chosen, or the way of dealing with them. This came, he said, especially by the mistaking or misplacing of the last or furthest end of knowledge, as if there were sought in it a couch whereupon to rest a searching and restless spirit, or a terrace for a wandering and variable mind to walk up and down with a fair prospect, or a tower of state for a proud mind to raise itself upon, or a fort or commanding ground for strife and contention, or a shop for profit or sale, and not a rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. The rest of the first book was given to an argument upon the dignity of learning, and the second book, on the advancement of learning, is, as Bacon himself described it, a general and faithful perambulation of learning, with an inquiry what parts thereof lie fresh and waste, and not improved and converted by the industry of man, to the end that such a plot made and recorded to memory may both minister light to any public designation, and also serve to excite voluntary endeavors. Bacon makes, by a sort of exhaustive analysis, a ground plan of all subjects of study, as an intellectual map, helping the right inquirer in his search for the right path. The right path is that by which he has the best chance of adding to the stock of knowledge in the world something worth laboring for. And the true worth is in labor for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. H.M. The first book of Francis Bacon of the Proficience and Advancement of Learning, Divine and Human. To the King. There were under the law, excellent King, both daily sacrifices and freewill offerings, the one proceeding upon ordinary observance, the other upon a devout cheerfulness. In like manner there belongeth to kings from their servants both tribute of duty and presents of affection. In the former of these I hope I shall not live to be wanting, according to my most humble duty, and the good pleasure of your Majesty's employments. For the latter, I thought it more respective to make choice of some oblation, which might rather refer to the propriety and excellency of your individual person, than to the business of your crown and state. Wherefore, representing your Majesty many times unto my mind, and beholding you not with the inquisitive eye of presumption, to discover that which the Scripture telleth me is inscrutable, but with the observant eye of duty and admiration, leaving aside the other parts of your virtue and fortune, I have been touched, yea, and possessed with an extreme wonder at those your virtues and faculties, which the philosophers call intellectual, the largeness of your capacity, the faithfulness of your memory, the swiftness of your apprehension, the penetration of your judgment, and the facility and order of your elocution, and I have often thought that of all the persons living that I have known, your Majesty were the best instance to make a man of Plato's opinion, that all knowledge is but remembrance, and that the mind of man by nature knoweth all things, and hath but her own native and original notions, which by the strangeness and darkness of this tabernacle of the body are sequestered again, revived and restored. Such a light of nature I have observed in your Majesty, and such a readiness to take flame and blaze from the least occasion presented, or the least spark of another's knowledge delivered. And as the Scripture saith of the wisest king, that his heart was as the sands of the sea, which, though it be one of the largest bodies, yet it consisteth of the smallest and finest portions. So hath God given your Majesty a composition of understanding admirable, being able to compass and comprehend the greatest matters, and nevertheless to touch and apprehend the least, whereas it should seem an impossibility in nature for the same instrument to make itself fit for great and small works. And for your gift of speech I call to mind what Cornelius Tacitus saith of Augustus Caesar, Augusto profluens, et qui principium deserit, eloquentia fuit. For, if we note it well, speech that is uttered with labor and difficulty, or speech that savoureth of the affectation of art and precepts, or speech that is framed after the imitation of some pattern of eloquence, though never so excellent, all this hath somewhat servile, and holding of the subject. But your Majesty's manner of speech is, indeed, prince-like, flowing as from a fountain, and yet streaming and branching itself into nature's order, full of facility and felicity, imitating none, and inimitable by any. And as in your civil estate there appeareth to be an emulation and contention of your Majesty's virtue with your fortune, a virtuous disposition with a fortunate regiment, a virtuous expectation when time was of your greater fortune, with a prosperous possession thereof in the due time, a virtuous observation of the laws of marriage, with most blessed and happy fruit of marriage, a virtuous and most Christian desire of peace, with a fortunate inclination in your neighbor princes thereunto. So likewise in these intellectual matters there seemeth to be no less contention between the excellency of your Majesty's gifts of nature and the universality and perfection of your learning. For I am well assured that this which I shall say is no amplification at all, but a positive and measured truth, which is, that there hath not been since Christ's time any king or temporal monarch which hath been so learned in all literature and erudition, divine and human. For let a man seriously and diligently revolve and peruse the succession of the emperors of Rome, of which Caesar the dictator, who lived some years before Christ, and Marcus Antoninus were the best learned, and so descend to the emperors of Grecia or of the West, and then to the lines of France, Spain, England, Scotland, and the rest, and he shall find this judgment is truly made. For it seemeth much in a king if, by the compendious extractions of other men's wits and labors, he can take hold of any superficial ornaments and shows of learning, or if he countenance and prefer learning and learned men, but to drink, indeed, of the true fountains of learning, nay, to have such a fountain of learning in himself, in a king, and in a king born, is almost a miracle. And the more, because there is met in your Majesty a rare conjunction, as well of divine and sacred literature as of profane and human. So as your Majesty standeth invested of that triplicity, which in great veneration was ascribed to the ancient Hermes, the power and fortune of a king, the knowledge and illumination of a priest, and the learning and universality of a philosopher. This propriety inherent and individual attribute in your Majesty deserveth to be expressed not only in the fame and admiration of the present time, nor in the history or tradition of the ages succeeding, but also in some solid work, fixed memorial, and immortal monument, bearing a character or signature both of the power of a king and the difference and perfection of such a king. Therefore I did conclude with myself that I could not make unto your Majesty a better oblation than of some treatise tending to that end, whereof the sum will consist of these two parts, the former concerning the excellency of learning and knowledge, and the excellency of the merit and true glory in the augmentation and propagation thereof. The latter, what the particular acts and works are which have been embraced and undertaken for the advancement of learning, and again, what defects and undervalues I find in such particular acts, to the end that though I cannot positively or affirmatively advise your Majesty, or propound unto you framed particulars, yet I may excite your princely cogitations to visit the excellent treasure of your own mind, and thence to extract particulars for this purpose agreeable to your magnanimity and wisdom. I, one in the entrance to the former of these to clear the way and, as it were, to make silence, to have the true testimonies concerning the dignity of learning to be better heard, without the interruption of tacit objections. I think good to deliver it from the discredits and disgraces which it hath received, all from ignorance, but ignorance severally disguised, appearing sometimes in the zeal and jealousy of divines, sometimes in the severity and arrogancy of politics, and sometimes in the errors and imperfections of learned men themselves. 2. I hear the former sort say that knowledge is of those things which are to be accepted of with great limitation and caution, that the aspiring to overmuch knowledge was the original temptation and sin whereupon ensued the fall of man, that knowledge hath in it somewhat of the serpent, and therefore, where it entereth into a man it makes him swell. Scientia inflat, that Solomon gives a censure, that there is no end of making books, and that much reading is weariness of the flesh. And again in another place, that in spacious knowledge there is much contrastation, and that he that increaseth knowledge increaseth anxiety. That St. Paul gives a caveat, that we be not spoiled through vain philosophy, that experience demonstrates how learned men have been arch heretics, how learned times have been inclined to atheism, and how the contemplation of second causes doth derogate from our dependence upon God, who is the first cause. 3. To discover, then, the ignorance and error of this opinion, and the misunderstanding in the grounds thereof. It may well appear these men do not observe or consider that it was not the pure knowledge of nature and universality, a knowledge by the light whereof man did give names unto other creatures in paradise, as they were brought before him according unto their proprieties, which gave the occasion to the fall, but it was the proud knowledge of good and evil, with an intent in man to give law unto himself, and to depend no more upon God's commandments, which was the form of the temptation. Neither is it any quantity of knowledge, how great soever, that can make the mind of man to swell. For nothing can fill, much less extend the soul of man, but God and the contemplation of God. And, therefore, Solomon, speaking of the two principal senses of inquisition, the eye and the ear, affirmeth that the eye is never satisfied with seeing, nor the ear with hearing, and if there be no fullness, then is the continent greater than the content, so of knowledge itself, and the mind of man. Whereto the senses are but reporters, he defineth likewise in these words, placed after that calendar or ephemerides which he maketh of the diversities of times and seasons for all actions and purposes. And concludeth thus, God hath made all things beautiful or decent, in the true return of their seasons. Also he hath placed the world in man's heart, yet cannot man find out the work which God worketh from the beginning to the end, declaring not obscurely that God hath framed the mind of man as a mirror or glass, capable of the image of the universal world, and joyful to receive the impression thereof, as the eye joyeth to receive light. And not only delighted in beholding the variety of things and vicissitude of times, but raised also to find out and discern the ordinances and decrees which throughout all those changes are infallibly observed. And although he doth insinuate that the supreme or summary law of nature which he calleth the work which God worketh from the beginning to the end is not possible to be found out by man, yet that doth not derogate from the capacity of the mind, but may be referred to the impediments, as of shortness of life, ill conjunction of labors, ill tradition of knowledge over from hand to hand, and many other inconveniences, whereunto the condition of man is subject, for that nothing parcel of the world is denied to man's inquiry and invention. He doth in another place rule over, when he saith, the spirit of man is as the lamp of God, wherewith he searcheth the inwardness of all secrets. If, then, such be the capacity and receipt of the mind of man, it is manifest that there is no danger at all in the proportion or quantity of knowledge, how large soever, lest it should make it swell or outcompass itself. No, but it is merely the quality of knowledge, which, be it in quantity more or less, if it be taken without the true corrective thereof, hath in it some nature of venom or malignity, and some effects of that venom, which is ventosity or swelling. This corrective spice, the mixture whereof maketh knowledge so sovereign, is charity, which the Apostle immediately addeth to the former clause. For so he saith, knowledge bloweth up, but charity buildeth up, not unlike unto that which he delivereth in another place, if I spake, saith he, with the tongues of men and angels, and had not charity, it were but as a tinkling cymbal. Not but that it is an excellent thing to speak with the tongues of men and angels, but because if it be severed from charity, and not referred to the good of men and mankind, it hath rather a sounding and unworthy glory than a meriting and substantial virtue. And as for that censure of Solomon concerning the excess of writing and reading books, and the anxiety of spirit which redoundeth from knowledge, and that admonition of St. Paul, that we be not seduced by vain philosophy, let those places be rightly understood. And they do, indeed, excellently set forth the true bounds and limitations whereby human knowledge is confined and circumscribed, and yet without any such contracting or coarctation, but that it may comprehend all the universal nature of things. For these limitations are three. The first, that we do not so place our felicity in knowledge, as we forget our mortality. The second, that we make application of our knowledge, to give ourselves repose and contentment, and not distaste or repining. The third, that we do not presume by the contemplation of nature to attain to the mysteries of God. For as touching the first of these, Solomon doth excellently expound himself in another place of the same book, where he saith, I saw well that knowledge recedeth as far from ignorance as light doth from darkness, and that the wise man's eyes keep watch in his head, whereas this fool roundeth about in darkness. But withal I learned that the same mortality involveth them both. And for the second, certain it is there is no vexation or anxiety of mind which resulteth from knowledge otherwise than merely by accident. For all knowledge and wonder which is the seed of knowledge is an impression of pleasure in itself. But when men fall to framing conclusions out of their knowledge, applying it to their particular, and ministering to themselves thereby weak fears or vast desires, there groweth that carefulness and trouble of mind, which is spoken of, for then knowledge is no more lumen siccum. Whereof Heraclitus the profound said, lumen siccum optima anima, but it becometh lumen matidum or maceratum, being steeped and infused in the humours of the affections. And as for the third point, it deserveth to be a little stood upon, and not to be lightly passed over. For if any man shall think by view and inquiry into these sensible and material things to attain that light, whereby he may reveal unto himself the nature or will of God, then, indeed, is he spoiled by vain philosophy. For the contemplation of God's creatures and works produceth having regard to the works and creatures themselves knowledge, but having regard to God no perfect knowledge, but wonder, which is broken knowledge. And therefore, it was most aptly said by one of Plato's school, that the sense of man carrieth a resemblance with the sun, which as we see openeth and revealeth all the terrestrial globe, but then, again, it obscureth and concealeth the stars and celestial globe. But it darkeneth and shutteth up divine. And hence it is true that it hath proceeded, that divers great learned men have been heretical, whilst they have sought to fly up to the secrets of the deity by this waxen wings of the senses. And as for the conceit, that too much knowledge should incline a man to atheism, and that the ignorance of second causes should make a more devout dependence upon God, which is the first cause first, it is good to ask the question which Job asked of his friends, will you lie for God? As one man will lie for another, to gratify him, for certain it is that God worketh nothing in nature, but by second causes. And if they would have it otherwise believed, it is mere imposture, as it were in favour towards God, and nothing else but to offer to the author of truth the unclean sacrifice of a lie. But further, it is an assured truth, and a conclusion of experience, that a little or superficial knowledge of philosophy may incline the mind of men to atheism, but a further proceeding therein doth bring the mind back again to religion. For in the entrance of philosophy, when the second causes, which are next unto the senses, do offer themselves to the mind of man. If it dwell and stay there, it may induce some oblivion of the highest cause, but when a man passeth on further and seeth the dependence of causes and the works of providence, then, according to the allegory of the poets, he will easily believe that the highest link of nature's chain must needs be tied to the foot of Jupiter's chair. To conclude, therefore, let no man upon a weak conceit of sobriety, or an ill-applied moderation, think or maintain that a man can search too far, or be too well studied in the book of God's word, or in the book of God's works, divinity or philosophy. But rather let men endeavor an endless progress or proficience in both. Only let men beware that they apply both to charity, and not to swelling, to use, and not to ostentation, and again, that they do not unwisely mingle or confound these learnings together. Rom. 2:1. And as for the disgraces which learning receiveth from politics, they be of this nature, that learning doth soften men's minds, and makes them more unapt for the honor and exercise of arms, that it doth mar and pervert men's dispositions for matter of government and policy, in making them too curious and irresolute by variety of reading, or too peremptory or positive by strictness of rules and axioms, or too immoderate and overweening by reason of the greatness of examples, or too incompatible and differing from the times by reason of the dissimilitude of examples, or at least that it doth divert men's travails from action and business, and bringeth them to a love of leisure and privateness, and that it doth bring into states a relaxation of discipline, whilst every man is more ready to argue than to obey and execute. Out of this conceit Cato, surnamed the Censor, one of the wisest men indeed that ever lived, when Carneades the philosopher came in embassage to Rome, and that the young men of Rome began to flock about him, being allured with the sweetness and majesty of his eloquence and learning, gave counsel in open senate that they should give him his dispatch with all speed, lest he should infect and enchant the minds and affections of the youth, and at unawares bring in an alteration of the manners and customs of the state. Out of the same conceit or humor did Virgil, turning his pen to the advantage of his country and the disadvantage of his own profession, make a kind of separation between policy and government, and between arts and sciences, in the verses so much renowned, attributing and challenging the one to the Romans and leaving and yielding the other to the Grecians, two rigor imperio popules. Romain memento, he tibi erunt arts, and so likewise we see that Anytus, the accuser of Socrates, laid it as an article of charge and accusation against him, that he did, with the variety and power of his discourses and disputations, withdraw young men from due reverence to the laws and customs of their country, and that he did profess a dangerous and pernicious science, which was to make the worse matter seem the better, and to suppress truth by force of eloquence and speech. 2. But these and the like imputations have rather a countenance of gravity than any ground of justice, for experience doth warrant that, both in persons and in times, there hath been a meeting and concurrence in learning and arms flourishing and excelling in the same men and the same ages. For as for men, There cannot be a better nor the like instance as of that pair, Alexander the Great and Julius Caesar. The dictator, whereof the one was Aristotle's scholar in philosophy, and the other was Cicero's rival in eloquence. Or if any man had rather call for scholars that were great generals, and generals that were great scholars, let him take Epaminondas the Theban, or Xenophon the Athenian, whereof the one was the first that abated the power of Sparta, and the other was the first that made way to the overthrow of the monarchy of Persia. And this concurrence is yet more visible in times than in persons, by how much an age is greater object than a man. For both in Egypt, Assyria, Persia, Grecia, and Rome, the same times that are most renowned for arms are likewise most admired for learning, so that the greatest authors and philosophers, and the greatest captains and governors, have lived in the same ages. Neither can it otherwise he, for as in man the ripeness of strength of the body and mind cometh much about an age, save that the strength of the body cometh somewhat the more early, so in states, arms, and learning, whereof the one correspondeth to the body, the other to the soul of man, have a concurrence or near sequence in times. 3. And for matter of policy and government, that learning should rather hurt than enable thereunto, is a thing very improbable. We see it is accounted an error to commit a natural body to empiric physicians, which commonly have a few pleasing receipts whereupon they are confident and adventurous, but know neither the causes of diseases, nor the complexions of patients, nor peril of accidents, nor the true method of cures. We see it is a like error to rely upon advocates or lawyers which are only men of practice, and not grounded in their books, who are many times easily surprised, when matter falleth out besides their experience, to the prejudice of the causes they handle. So by like reason it cannot be but a matter of doubtful consequence if states be managed by empiric statesmen, not well mingled with men grounded in learning. But contrariwise, it is almost without instance contradictory, that ever any government was disastrous that was in the hands of learned governors. For howsoever it hath been ordinary with politic men to extenuate and disable learned men by the names of pedantes, yet in the records of time it appeareth in many particulars, that the governments of princes in minority, notwithstanding the infinite disadvantage of that kind of state, have nevertheless excelled the government of princes of mature age, even for that reason which they seek to traduce, which is that by that occasion the state hath been in the hands of pedantes, for so was the state of Rome for the first 5 years, which are so much magnified during the minority of Nero, in the hands of Seneca, a pedante. So it was again, for 10 years' space or more, during the minority of Gordianus the Younger, with great applause and contentation in the hands of Misitheus, a pedante. So was it before that, in the minority of Alexander Severus, in like happiness, in hands not much unlike, by reason of the rule of the women, who were aided by the teachers and preceptors. Nay, let a man look into the government of the bishops of Rome as by name, into the government of Pius Quintus and Sextus Quintus in our times, who were both at their entrance esteemed, but as pedantical friars, and he shall find that such popes do greater things, and proceed upon truer principles of state than those which have ascended to the papacy from an education and breeding in affairs of state and courts of princes. For although men bred in learning are perhaps to seek in points of convenience and accommodating for the present, which the Italians call ragioni di Stato, whereof the same Pius Quintus could not hear spoken with patience, terming them inventions against religion and the moral virtues, yet, on the other side, to recompense that they are perfect in those same plain grounds of religion, justice, honor, and moral virtue, which if they be well and watchfully pursued, there will be seldom use of those other, no more than of physic in a sound or well-dieted body. Neither can the experience of one man's life furnish examples and precedents for the event of one man's life. For, as it happeneth sometimes that the grandchild, or other descendant, resembleth the ancestor more than the son, so many times occurrences of present times may sort better with ancient examples than with those of the later or immediate times. And lastly, the wit of one man can no more countervail learning than one man's means can hold way with a common purse. 4. And as for those particular seducements or indispositions of the mind for policy and government, which learning is pretended to insinuate, if it be granted that any such thing be, it must be remembered withal that learning ministereth in every of them greater strength of medicine or remedy than it offereth cause of indisposition or infirmity. For, if by a secret operation it make men perplexed and irresolute, on the other side by plain precept it teacheth them when and upon what ground to resolve, yea, and how to carry things in suspense, without prejudice, till they resolve. If it make men positive and regular, it teacheth them what things are in their nature demonstrative, and what are conjectural, and as well the use of distinctions and exceptions, as the latitude of principles and rules. If it mislead by disproportion or dissimilitude of examples, it teacheth men the force of circumstances, the errors of comparisons, and all the cautions of application, so that in all these it doth rectify more effectually than it can pervert, and these medicines it conveyeth into men's minds much more forcibly by the quickness and penetration of examples. For let a man look into the errors of Clement, Romans 7, so lively described by Guicciardini, who served under him, or into the errors of Cicero, painted out by his own pencil in his epistles to Atticus, and he will fly apace from being irresolute. Let him look into the errors of Phocion, and he will beware how he be obstinate or inflexible. Let him but read the fable of Ixion, and it will hold him from being vaporous or imaginative. Let him look into the errors of Cato Roman too, and he will never be one of the antipodes, to tread opposite to the present world. 5. And for the conceit that learning should dispose men to leisure and privateness, and make men slothful, it were a strange thing if that which accustometh the mind to a perpetual motion and agitation should induce slothfulness. Whereas, contrariwise, it may be truly affirmed that no kind of men love business for itself but those that are learned. For other persons love it for profit, as a hireling that loves the work for the wages, or for honor, as because it beareth them up in the eyes of men, and refresheth their reputation, which otherwise would wear. or because it putteth them in mind of their fortune, and giveth them occasion to pleasure and displeasure, or because it exerciseth some faculty wherein they take pride, and so entertaineth them in good humour and pleasing conceits towards themselves, or because it advanceth any other their ends. So that, as it is said of untrue valours, that some men's valours are in the eyes of them that look on, so such men's industries are in the eyes of others, or, at least, in regard of their own designments. Only learned men love business as an action according to nature, as agreeable to health of mind as exercise is to health of body, taking pleasure in the action itself, and not in the purchase, so that of all men they are the most indefatigable, if it be towards any business which can hold or detain their mind. 6. And if any man be laborious in reading and study, and yet idle in business and action, it groweth from some weakness of body or softness of spirit, such as Seneca speaketh of quidem tam sunt umbratiles, apputant in turbido est quicquid in luce est, and not of learning. Well may it be that such a point of a man's nature may make him give himself to learning. But it is not learning that breedeth any such point in his nature. 7. And that learning should take up too much time or leisure, I answer, the most active or busy man that hath been or can be, hath no question many vacant times of leisure, while he expecteth the tides and returns of business, except he be either tedious and of no dispatch, or lightly and unworthily ambitious to meddle in things that may be better done by others. And then the question is but how those spaces and times of leisure shall be filled and spent, whether in pleasure or in studies, as was well answered by Demosthenes to his adversary Aeschines, that was a man given to pleasure, and told him that his orations did smell of the lamp. Indeed, said Demosthenes, there is a great difference between the things that you and I do by lamplight. So as no man need doubt that learning will expel business, but rather it will keep and defend the possession of the mind against idleness and pleasure, which otherwise at unawares may enter to the prejudice of both. 8. Again, for that other conceit, that learning should undermine the reverence of laws and government, it is assuredly a mere depravation and calumny, without all shadow of truth. For to say that a blind custom of obedience should be a surer obligation than duty taught and understood, it is to affirm that a blind man may tread surer by a guide than a seeing man can by a light. And it is without all controversy that learning doth make the minds of men gentle, generous, manageable, and pliant to government, whereas ignorance makes them churlish, forte, and mutinous, and the evidence of time doth clear this assertion, considering that the most barbarous, rude, and unlearned times have been most subject to tumults seditious and changes. 9. And as to the judgment of Cato the censor, he was well punished for his blasphemy against learning, in the same kind wherein he offended, for when he was past 80 years old, he was taken with an extreme desire to go to school again, and to learn the Greek tongue, to the end to peruse the Greek authors, which doth well demonstrate that his former censure of the Grecian learning was rather an affected gravity than according to the inward sense of his own opinion. And as for Virgil's verses, though it pleased him to brave the world in taking to the Romans the art of empire, and leaving to others the arts of subjects. Yet so much is manifest, that the Romans never ascended to that height of empire till the time they had ascended to the height of other arts. For, in the time of the two first Caesars, which had the art of government in greatest perfection, there lived the best poet, Virgilius Maro, the best historiographer, Titus Livius, the best antiquary, Marcus Varro, and the best or second orator, Marcus Cicero, that to the memory of man are known. As for the accusation of Socrates, the time must be remembered when it was prosecuted, which was under the 30 tyrants, the most base, bloody, and envious persons that have governed, which revolution of state was no sooner over but Socrates, whom they had made a person criminal, was made a person heroical, and his memory accumulate with honors divine and human, and those discourses of his which were then termed corrupting of manners, were after acknowledged for sovereign medicines of the mind and manners, and so have been received ever since till this day. Let this, therefore, serve for answer to politics, which in their humorous severity, or in their feigned gravity, have presumed to throw imputations upon learning, which redargution nevertheless save that we know not whether our labors may extend to other ages were not needful for the present, in regard of the love and reverence towards learning which the example and countenance of two so learned princes, Queen Elizabeth and your Majesty, being as Castor and Pollux, lucida sidera, stars of excellent light and most benign influence, hath wrought in all men of place and authority in our nation. Roman 3:1. Now therefore we come to that third sort of discredit or diminution of credit that groweth unto learning from learned men themselves, which commonly cleaveth fastest. It is either from their fortune, or from their manners, or from the nature of their studies. For the first, it is not in their power, and the second is accidental, the third only is proper to be handled, but because we are not in hand with true measure, but with popular estimation and conceit, it is not amiss to speak somewhat of the two former. The derogations, therefore, which grow to learning from the fortune or condition of learned men, are either in respect of scarcity of means, or in respect of privateness of life and meanness of employments. 2. Concerning want, and that it is the case of learned men usually to begin with little, and not to grow rich so fast as other men, by reason they convert not their labors chiefly to lucre and increase. It were good to leave the commonplace in commendation of poverty to some friar to handle, to whom much was attributed by Machiavel in this point when he said that the kingdom of the clergy had been long before at an end, if the reputation and reverence towards the poverty of friars had not borne out the scandal of the superfluities and excesses of bishops and prelates. So a man might say that the felicity and delicacy of princes and great persons had long since turned to rudeness and barbarism, if the poverty of learning had not kept up civility and honor of life, but without any such advantages. It is worthy the observation what a reverent and honored thing poverty of fortune was for some ages in the Roman state, which nevertheless was a state without paradoxes. For we see what Titus Livius saith in his introduction Ceterum aut me amor negotii suscepti follit aut nulla unquam respublica nec major. Nec sanctir, nec bonis exemplis ditir fuit, nec in quam tam siro avaritia luxuriat immigraverint. Nec ubi tentis ac tem diu paupertati ac parsimonii honos furit. We see likewise, after that the state of Rome was not itself, but did degenerate, how that person that took upon him to be counsellor to Julius Caesar after his victory, where to begin his restoration of the state, maketh it of all points the most summary to take away the estimation of wealth, verum hic omnia mala parator cum honor pecunii designant. Si nec magistratus, nec alia vulgo cupienda, venalia erunt. To conclude this point, as it was truly said, that paupertas est virtutis fortuna, though sometimes it come from vice, so it may be fitly said that, though sometimes it may proceed from misgovernment and accident, surely Solomon hath pronounced it both in censure, qui festinat ad divitias non erit in sons, and in precept by the truth, and sell it not, and so of wisdom and knowledge, judging that means were to be spent upon learning, and not learning to be applied to means. And as for the privateness or obscureness, as it may be in vulgar estimation accounted of life of contemplative men, it is a theme so common to extol a private life, not taxed with sensuality and sloth, in comparison and to the disadvantage of a civil life. For safety, liberty, pleasure, and dignity, or at least freedom from indignity, as no man handleth it but handleth it well, such a consonancy it hath to men's conceits in the expressing, and to men's consents in the allowing. This only I will add, that learned men forgotten in states and not living in the eyes of men, are like the images of Cassius and Brutus in the funeral of Junia, of which, not being represented as many others were, Tacitus saith, eo ipso prefulgevent quod non vispantur. 3. And for meanness of employment, that which is most traduced to contempt is that the government of youth is commonly allotted to them, which age, because it is the age of least authority, it is transferred to the disesteeming of those employments wherein youth is conversant, and which are conversant about youth. But how unjust this traducement is, if you will reduce things from popularity of opinion to measure of reason, may appear in that we see men are more curious what they put into a new vessel than into a vessel seasoned, and what mold they lay about a young plant than about a plant corroborate, so as this weakest terms and times of all things use to have the best applications and helps. And will you hearken to the Hebrew rabbins? Your young men shall see visions, and your old men shall dream dreams, say they. Youth is the worthier age, for that visions are nearer apparitions of God than dreams. And let it be noted, that howsoever the condition of life of pedantes hath been scorned upon theatres, as the ape of tyranny, and that the modern looseness or negligence hath taken no due regard to the choice of schoolmasters and tutors, yet the ancient wisdom of the best times did always make a just complaint, that states were too busy with their laws and too negligent in point of education, which excellent part of ancient discipline hath been in some sort revived of late times by the colleges of the Jesuits, of whom, although in regard of their superstition I may say quo meliors, eo deteriors, yet in regard of this, and some other points concerning human learning and moral matters, I may say, as Agesilaus said to his enemy Pharnabazus, talis quam sis utunam noster esses, and that much touching the discredits drawn from the fortunes of learned men. For, as touching the manners of learned men, it is a thing personal and individual, and no doubt there be amongst them, in other professions of all temperatures, but yet so as it is not without truth which is said, that abunt studia in mores. Studies have an influence and operation upon the manners of those that are conversant in them. 5. But upon an attentive and indifferent review, I for my part cannot find any disgrace to learning can proceed from the manners of learned men, not inherent to them as they are learned, except it be a fault which was the supposed fault of Demosthenes, Cicero, Cato Roman II, Seneca, and many more, that because the times they read of are commonly better than the times they live in, and the duties taught better than the duties practiced, they contend sometimes too far to bring things to perfection, and to reduce the corruption of manners to honesty of precepts or examples of too great height. And yet hereof they have caveats enough in their own walks. For Solon, when he was asked whether he had given his citizens the best laws, answered wisely, yea, of such as they would receive, and Plato, finding that his own heart could not agree with the corrupt manners of his country, refused to bear place or office, saying that a man's country was to be used as his parents were, that is, with humble persuasions, and not with contestations. And Caesar's counsellor put in the same caveat, non ad vetera instituta revocans qui jam praedam corruptis moribus ludibrio sunt. And Cicero noteth this error directly in Cato Roman II, when he writes to his friend Atticus, Cato optime sentit, sed nascit interdum republici, loquitur enim tanquam in republica Platonis, non tanquam in feas Romuli. And the same Cicero doth excuse and expound the philosophers for going too far and being too exact in their prescripts, when he saith, Isti eps preceptors virtutis et magistri videntur fines officiorum Paulo longius quam natura velit protulis, ut cum ad ultimum animo contendissemis, ibi tamen, ubi apportet consistoremis, and yet himself might have said, Benitus sum minor ips meis, for it was his own fault, though not in so extreme a degree. 6. Another fault likewise much of this kind hath been incident to learned men, which is, that they have esteemed the preservation, good, and honor of their countries or masters before their own fortunes or safeties. For so saith Demosthenes unto the Athenians, if it please you to note it, my counsels unto you are not such whereby I should grow great amongst you, and you become little amongst the Grecians, but they be of that nature as they are sometimes not good for me to give, but are always good for you to follow. And so Seneca, after he had consecrated that quinquennium Nerones to the eternal glory of learned governors, held on his honest and loyal course of good and free counsel after his master grew extremely corrupt in his government. Neither can this point otherwise be, for learning endueth men's minds with a true sense of the frailty of their persons, the casualty of their fortunes, and the dignity of their soul and vocation, so that it is impossible for them to esteem that any greatness of their own fortune can be a true or worthy end of their being and ordainment. and therefore are desirous to give their account to God, and so likewise to their masters under God as kings and the states that they serve in those words. Ex tibi lucrefeci, and not ex mihi lucrefeci, whereas the corrupter sort of mere politiques, that have not their thoughts established by learning in the love and apprehension of duty, nor never look abroad into universality, do refer all things to themselves, and thrust themselves into the centre of the world, as if all lines should meet in them and their fortunes, never caring in all tempests what becomes of the ship of state, so they may save themselves in the cockboat of their own fortune, whereas men that feel the weight of duty and know the limits of self-love use to make good their places and duties, though with peril, and if they stand in seditious and violent alterations, it is rather the reverence which many times both adverse parts do give to honesty, than any versatile advantage of their own carriage. But for this point of tender sense and fast obligation of duty which learning doth endue the mind withal, howsoever fortune may tax it, and many in the depth of their corrupt principles may despise it, yet it will receive an open allowance, and therefore needs the less disproof or excuse. 7. Another fault incident commonly to learned men, which may be more properly defended than truly denied, is that they fail sometimes in applying themselves to particular persons, which want of exact application ariseth from two causes. The one, because the largeness of their mind can hardly confine itself to dwell in the exquisite observation or examination of the nature and customs of one person, for it is a speech for a lover, and not for a wise man, satis magnum alter alteri theatrum sumus. Nevertheless I shall yield, that he that cannot contract the sight of his mind as well as disperse and dilate it, wanteth a great faculty. But there is a second cause, which is no inability, but a rejection upon choice and judgment. For the honest and just bounds of observation by one person upon another extend no further, but to understand him sufficiently, whereby not to give him offense, or whereby to be able to give him faithful counsel, or whereby to stand upon reasonable guard and caution in respect of a man's self, but to be speculative into another man to the end to know how to work him, or wind him, or govern him, proceedeth from a heart that is double and cloven, and not entire and ingenuous, which as in friendship it is want of integrity, so towards princes or superiors is want of duty. Is in the outward ceremony barbarous, but the moral is good, for men ought not, by cunning and bent observations, to pierce and penetrate into the hearts of kings, which the Scripture hath declared to be inscrutable. 8. There is yet another fault with which I will conclude this part, which is often noted in learned men, that they do many times fail to observe decency and discretion in their behavior and carriage, and commit errors in small and ordinary points of action, so as the vulgar sort of capacities do make a judgment of them in greater matters by that which they find wanting in them in smaller. But this consequence doth oft deceive men, for which I do refer them over to that which was said by Themistocles, arrogantly and uncivilly being applied to himself out of his own mouth, but, being applied to the general state of this question, pertinently and justly, when, being invited to touch a lute, he said, he could not fiddle, but he could make a small town a great state. So no doubt many may be well seen in the passages of government and policy, which are to seek in little and punctual occasions. I refer them also to that which Plato said of his master Socrates, whom he compared to the gallipots of apothecaries, which on the outside had apes and owls and antiques, but contained within sovereign and precious liquors and confections. Acknowledging that, to an external report, he was not without superficial levities and deformities, but was inwardly replenished with excellent virtues and powers. And so much touching the point of manners of learned men. 9. But in the meantime I have no purpose to give allowance to some conditions and courses base and unworthy, wherein divers professors of learning have wronged themselves and gone too far, such as were those trencher philosophers which in the later age of the Roman state were usually in the houses of great persons, being little better than solemn parasites, of which kind Lucian maketh a merry description of the philosopher, that the great lady took to ride with her in her coach, and would needs have him carry her little dog, which he doing officiously and yet uncomely, the page scoffed and said, that he doubted the philosopher of a Stoic would turn to be a cynic. But, above all the rest, this gross and palpable flattery whereunto many not unlearned have abased and abused their wits and pens, turning as do Bartus saith Hecuba into Helena, and Faustina into Lucretia, hath most diminished the price and estimation of learning. Neither is the modern dedication of books and writings, as to patrons, to be commended, for that books such as are worthy the name of books ought to have no patrons but truth and reason. And the ancient custom was to dedicate them only to private and equal friends, or to entitle the books with their names, or if to kings and great persons, it was to some such as the argument of the book was fit and proper for. But these and the like courses may deserve rather reprehension than defense. 10. Not that I can tax or condemn the morigeration or application of learned men to men in fortune. For the answer was good that Diogenes made to one that asked him in mockery, how it came to pass that philosophers were the followers of rich men, and not rich men of philosophers. He answered soberly and yet sharply, because the one sort knew what they had need of, and the other did not. And of the like nature was the answer which Aristippus made, when having a petition to Dionysius, and no ear given to him, he fell down at his feet, whereupon Dionysius stayed, and gave him the hearing, and granted it. And afterwards some person, tender on the behalf of philosophy, reproved Aristippus that he would offer the profession of philosophy such an indignity, as for a private suit to fall at a tyrant's feet. But he answered, it was not his fault, but it was the fault of Dionysius, that had his ears in his feet. Neither was it accounted weakness, discretion, in him that would not dispute his best with Adrianus Caesar, excusing himself that it was reason to yield to him that commanded 30 legions. These and the like applications, and stooping to points of necessity and convenience, cannot be disallowed. For though they may have some outward baseness, yet, in a judgment truly made, they are to be accounted submissions to the occasion and not to the person. Roman 4. 1. Now I proceed to those errors and vanities which have intervened amongst the studies themselves of the learned. which is that which is principal and proper to the present argument, wherein my purpose is not to make a justification of the errors, but by a censure and separation of the errors to make a justification of that which is good and sound, and to deliver that from the aspersion of the other. For we see that it is the manner of men to scandalize and deprave that which retaineth the state and virtue, by taking advantage upon that which is corrupt and degenerate, as the heathens in the primitive church used to blemish and taint the Christians with the faults and corruptions of heretics. But nevertheless I have no meaning at this time to make any exact animadversion of the errors and impediments in matters of learning, which are more secret and remote from vulgar opinion, but only to speak unto such as do fall under or near unto a popular observation. 2. There be therefore chiefly three vanities in studies, whereby learning hath been most traduced. For those things we do esteem vain which are either false or frivolous, those which either have no truth or no use. And those persons we esteem vain which are either credulous or curious, and curiosity is either in matter or words, so that in reason as well as in experience there fall out to be these three distempers, as I may term them, of learning: the first, fantastical learning; the second, contentious learning; and the last, delicate learning. Vain imaginations, vain altercations, and vain affectations, and with the last I will begin. Martin Luther, conducted, no doubt, by a higher providence, but, in discourse of reason, finding what a province he had undertaken against the Bishop of Rome and the degenerate traditions of the Church, and finding his own solitude, being in nowise aided by the opinions of his own time, was enforced to awake all antiquity, and to call former times to his succours to make a party against the present time. So that the ancient authors, both in divinity and in humanity, which had long time slept in libraries, began generally to be read and revolve, wherein those authors did write, for the better understanding of those authors, and the better advantage of pressing and applying their words. And thereof grew, again, a delight in their manner of style and phrase, and an admiration of that kind of writing, which was much furthered and precipitated by the enmity and opposition that the propounders of those primitive but seeming new opinions had against the schoolmen, who were generally of the contrary part, and whose writings were altogether in a differing style and form, taking liberty to coin and frame new terms of art to express their own sense, and to avoid circuit of speech, without regard to the pureness, pleasantness, and, as I may call it, lawfulness of the phrase or word. And again, because the great labor then was with the people, of whom the Pharisees were wont to say, execrabilis ista turba, qui non navit legem, for the winning and persuading of them, there grew of necessity in chief price and request eloquence and variety of discourse, as the fittest and forciblest access into the capacity of the vulgar sort, so that these four causes concurring the admiration of ancient authors, the hate of the schoolmen, the exact study of languages, and the efficacy of preaching did bring in an affectionate study of eloquence and copy of speech, which then began to flourish. This grew speedily to an excess, for men began to hunt more after words than matter, more after the choiceness of the phrase, and the round and clean composition of the sentence, and the sweet falling of the clauses, and the varying and illustration of their works with tropes and figures. Then after the weight of matter, worth of subject, soundness of argument, life of invention, or depth of judgment, then grew the flowing and watery vein of Osorius, the Portugal bishop, to be in price. Then did Sturmius spend such infinite and curious pains upon Cicero the orator and Hermogenes the rhetorician, besides his own books of periods and imitation, and the like. Then did Carr of Cambridge and Ascham with their lectures and writings almost deify Cicero and Demosthenes, and allure all young men that were studious unto that delicate and polished kind of learning. Then did Erasmus take occasion to make the scoffing echo, Decem annos consuumsi in legendo Cicerone, and the echo answered in Greek, one, asine. Then grew the learning of the schoolmen to be utterly despised as barbarous. In sum, the whole inclination and bent of those times was rather towards copy than weight. 3. Here therefore the first distemper of learning, when men study words and not matter. Whereof, though I have represented an example of late times, yet it hath been, and will be secundum magis et minus in all time. And how is it possible but this should have an operation to discredit learning, even with vulgar capacities? When they see learned men's works like the first letter of a patent or limited book, which though it hath large flourishes, yet it is but a letter, it seems to me that Pygmalion's frenzy is a good emblem or portraiture of this vanity. For words are but the images of matter, and except they have life of reason and invention, to fall in love with them is all one as to fall in love with a picture. 4. But yet notwithstanding it is a thing not hastily to be condemned, to clothe and adorn the obscurity even of philosophy itself with sensible and plausible elocution. For hereof we have great examples in Xenophon, Cicero, Seneca, Plutarch, and of Plato also in some degree. And hereof likewise there is great use, for surely, to the severe inquisition of truth, and the deep progress into philosophy. It is some hindrance because it is too early satisfactory to the mind of man, and quencheth the desire of further search before we come to a just period. Then if a man be to have any use of such knowledge in civil occasions of conference, counsel, persuasion, discourse, or the like, then shall he find it prepared to his hands in those authors which write in that manner. But the excess of this is so justly contemptible, that as Hercules, when he saw the image of Adonis, Venus Minion, in a temple, said in disdain, Nil sacries, so there is none of Hercules' followers in learning, that is, the more severe and laborious sort of inquirers into truth, but will despise those delicacies and affectations, as indeed capable of no divineness, and thus much of the first disease or distemper of learning. 5. The second which followeth is in nature worse than the former, for as substance of matter is better than beauty of words, so contrariwise vain matter is worse than vain words, wherein it seemeth the reprehension of St. Paul was not only proper for those times, but prophetical for the times following, and not only respective to divinity, but extensive to all knowledge, divita profanas vocum novitates. Et oppositions falsi niminis scientiae, for he assigneth two marks and badges of suspected and falsified science, the one, the novelty and strangeness of terms; the other, the strictness of positions, which of necessity doth induce oppositions. And so questions and altercations, surely, like as many substances in nature, which are solid, do putrefy and corrupt into worms, so it is the property of good and sound knowledge to putrefy and dissolve into a number of subtle, idle, unwholesome, and, as I may term them, vermiculate questions, which have indeed a kind of quickness and life of spirit, but no soundness of matter or goodness of quality. This kind of degenerate learning did chiefly reign amongst the schoolmen, who, having sharp and strong wits, and abundance of leisure, and small variety of reading, but their wits being shut up in the cells of a few authors, chiefly Aristotle, their dictator, as their persons were shut up in the cells of monasteries and colleges, and knowing little history, either of nature or time, did out of no great quantity of matter and infinite agitation of wit spin out unto us those laborious webs of learning which are extant in their books. For the wit and mind of man, if it work upon matter, which is the contemplation of the creatures of God, worketh according to the stuff and is limited thereby; but if it work upon itself, as the spider worketh his web, then it is endless, and brings forth indeed cobwebs of learning, admirable for the fineness of thread and work, but of no substance or profit. 6. This same unprofitable subtility or curiosity is of two sorts, either in the subject itself that they handle, when it is a fruitless speculation or controversy whereof there are no small number both in divinity and philosophy, or in the manner or method of handling of a knowledge, which amongst them was this upon every particular position or assertion to frame objections, and to those objections solutions, which solutions were for the most part not confutations, but distinctions, whereas indeed the strength of all sciences is, as the strength of the old man's faggot in the bond. For the harmony of a science, supporting each part the other, is and ought to be the true and brief confutation and suppression of all the smaller sort of objections. But, on the other side, if you take out every axiom, as the sticks of the faggot, one by one you may quarrel with them and bend them, and break them at your pleasure, so that, as was said of Seneca, verborum minutiae rerum frangit pondera, so a man may truly say of the schoolmen, questionem minutiae scientiarum frangunt soliditatem. For were it not better for a man in fair room to set up one great light, or branching candlestick of lights, than to go about with a small watch candle into every corner? And such is their method, that rests not so much upon evidence of truth proved by arguments, authorities, similitudes, examples, as upon particular confutations and solutions of every scruple, cavillation, and objection, breeding for the most part one question as fast as it solveth another. Even as in the former resemblance, when you carry the light into one corner, you darken the rest, so that the fable and fiction of Scylla seemeth to be a lively image of this kind of philosophy or knowledge, which was transformed into a comely virgin for the upper parts, but then candida succinctam latrentibus ingena monstris. So the generalities of the schoolmen are for a while good and proportionable, But then when you descend into their distinctions and decisions, instead of a fruitful womb for the use and benefit of man's life, they end in monstrous altercations and barking questions. So as it is not possible but this quality of knowledge must fall under popular contempt, the people being apt to contemn truths upon occasion of controversies and altercations. And to think, they are all out of their way which never meet, and when they see such degladiation about subtleties and matters of no use or moment, they easily fall upon that judgment of Dionysius of Syracusa, Verbo istis sunt senem odiosorum. 7. Notwithstanding, certain it is that if those schoolmen to their great thirst of truth and unwearied travail of wit had joined variety and universality of reading and contemplation, they had proved excellent lights to the great advancement of all learning and knowledge. But as they are great undertakers indeed, and fierce with dark keeping. But, as in the inquiry of the divine truth, their pride inclined to leave the oracle of God's word, and to vanish in the mixture of their own inventions, so in the inquisition of nature, they ever left the oracle of God's works, and adored the deceiving and deformed images which the unequal mirror of their own minds, or a few received authors or principles, did represent unto them. And thus much for the second disease of learning. 8. For the third vice or disease of learning, which concerneth deceit or untruth. It is of all the rest the foulest, as that which doth destroy the essential form of knowledge, which is nothing but a representation of truth, for the truth of being and the truth of knowing are one, differing no more than the direct beam and the beam reflected. This vice therefore brancheth itself into two sorts, delight in deceiving and aptness to be deceived. Imposture and credulity, which, although they appear to be of a diverse nature, the one seeming to proceed of cunning and the other of simplicity, yet certainly they do for the most part concur, for, as the verse noteth, percantatorum fugito, nam garrulus idem est. An inquisitive man is a prattler, so upon the like reason a credulous man is a deceiver, as we see it in fame, that he that will easily believe rumors will as easily augment rumors, and add somewhat to them of his own. Which Tacitus wisely noteth, when he saith fingunt simul credunt, so great an affinity hath fiction and belief. 9. This facility of credit and accepting or admitting things weakly authorized or warranted is of two kinds according to the subject. Or, as the lawyers speak, matter of fact, or else of matter of art and opinion. As to the former, we see the experience and inconvenience of this error in ecclesiastical history, which hath too easily received and registered reports and narrations of miracles wrought by martyrs, hermits, or monks of the desert, and other holy men, and their relics, shrines, chapels, and images, which though they had a passage for a time by the ignorance of the people, the superstitious simplicity of some, and the politic toleration of others holding them but as divine posies. Yet, after a period of time, when the mist began to clear up, they grew to be esteemed but as old wives' fables, impostures of the clergy, illusions of spirits, and badges of Antichrist, to the great scandal and detriment of religion. 10. So in natural history, we see there hath not been that choice and judgment used as ought to have been, as may appear in the writings of Plinius, Cardanus, Albertus, and divers of the Arabians, being fraught with much fabulous matter, a great part not only untried, but notoriously untrue, to the great derogation of the credit of natural philosophy with the grave and sober kind of wits, wherein the wisdom and integrity of Aristotle is worthy to be observed, that, having made so diligent and exquisite a history of living creatures, hath mingled it sparingly with any vain or feigned matter, and yet on the other side hath cast all prodigious narrations, which he thought worthy the recording, into one book, excellently discerning that matter of manifest truth, such whereupon observation and rule was to be built, was not to be mingled or weakened with matter of doubtful credit, and yet again, that rarities and reports that seem uncredible are not to be suppressed or denied to the memory of men. 11. And as for the facility of credit, which is yielded to arts and opinions, it is likewise of two kinds, either when too much belief is attributed to the arts themselves, or to certain authors in any art, the sciences themselves, which have had better intelligence and confederacy with the imagination of man than with his reason, are three in number: astrology, natural magic, and alchemy, of which sciences, nevertheless, the ends or pretenses are noble. For astrology pretendeth to discover that correspondence or concatenation which is between the superior globe and the inferior. Natural magic pretendeth to call and reduce natural philosophy from variety of speculations to the magnitude of works. And alchemy pretendeth to make separation of all the unlike parts of bodies which in mixtures of natures are incorporate. But the derivations and prosecutions to these ends, both in the theories and in the practices, are full of error and vanity, which the great professors themselves have sought to veil over and conceal by enigmatical writings, and referring themselves to oracular traditions and such other devices, to save the credit of impostures. And yet surely to alchemy this right is due, that it may be compared to the husbandman whereof Essex makes the fable, that, when he died, told his sons that he had left unto them gold buried underground in his vineyard. And they digged over all the ground, and gold they found none, but by reason of their stirring and digging the mold about the roots of their vines, they had a great vintage the year following. So assuredly the search and stir to make gold hath brought to light a great number of good and fruitful inventions and experiments, as well for the disclosing of nature as for the use of man's life. 12. And as for the overmuch credit that hath been given unto authors in sciences, in making them dictators, that their words should stand, and not consuls, to give advice, the damage is infinite that sciences have received thereby, as the principal cause that hath kept them low at a stay without growth or advancement. For hence it hath come, that in arts mechanical the first deviser comes shortest, and time addeth and perfecteth. But in sciences the first author goeth furthest, and time leaseth and corrupteth. So we see artillery, sailing, printing, and the like, were grossly managed at the first, and by time accommodated and refined. But contrariwise, the philosophies and sciences of Aristotle, Plato, Democritus, Hippocrates, Euclides, Archimedes of most vigour at the first, and by time degenerate and embased, whereof the reason is no other, but that in the former many wits and industries have contributed in one, and in the latter many wits and industries have been spent about the wit of someone, whom many times they have rather depraved than illustrated, for, as water will not ascend higher than the level of the first spring-head from whence it descendeth, so knowledge derived from Aristotle, and exempted from liberty of examination, will not rise again higher than the knowledge of Aristotle. And, therefore, although the position be good, apportet decentum credier, yet it must be coupled with this, apportet et actum judicare, for disciples do owe unto masters only a temporary belief, and a suspension of their own judgment, till they be fully instructed, and not an absolute resignation or perpetual captivity. And therefore, to conclude this point, I will say no more. But so let great authors have their due, as time, which is the author of authors, be not deprived of his due, which is further and further to discover truth. Thus have I gone over these three diseases of learning, besides the which there are some other rather peccant humours than formed diseases, which, nevertheless, are not so secret and intrinsic, but that they fall under a popular observation and traducement, and, therefore, are not to be passed over. The first of these is the extreme affecting of two extremities, the one antiquity, the other novelty, wherein it seemeth the children of time do take after the nature and malice of the father. For as he devoureth his children, so one of them seeketh to devour and suppress the other. While antiquity envieth there should be new additions, and novelty cannot be content to add, but it must deface. Surely the advice of the prophet is the true direction in this matter. State super vias antiquas, et vidit quinam sit via recta et bona et ambulate in e. Antiquity deserveth that reverence, that men should make a stand thereupon and discover what is the best way. But when the discovery is well taken, then to make progression, and to speak truly, antiquitas seculi juventus mundi. These times are the ancient times, when the world is ancient, and not those which we account ancient or deem retrogrado, by a computation backward from ourselves. To another error induced by the former is a distrust that anything should be now to be found out, which the world should have missed and passed over so long time, as if the same objection were to be made to time that Lucian maketh to Jupiter and other the heathen gods, of which he wondereth that they begot so many children in old time, and begot none in his time, and asketh whether they were become septuagenary, or whether the law Papia, made against old men's marriages, had restrained them. So it seemeth men doubt lest time is become past children and generation, wherein contrariwise we see commonly the levity and unconstancy of men's judgments, which till a matter be done, wonder that it can be done, and as soon as it is done, wonder again that it was no sooner done, as we see in the expedition of Alexander into Asia, which at first was prejudged as a vast and impossible enterprise, and yet afterwards it pleaseth Livy to make no more of it than this: nil aliud quam bene ossis vana contemner. And the same happened to Columbus in the western navigation. But, In intellectual matters it is much more common, as may be seen in most of the propositions of Euclid, which till they be demonstrate, they seem strange to our assent, but being demonstrate, our mind accepteth of them by a kind of relation as the lawyers speak, as if we had known them before. 3. Another error, that hath also some affinity with the former, is a conceit, that of former opinions or sects after variety and examination, the best hath still prevailed and suppressed the rest. So as if a man should begin the labor of a new search, he were but like to light upon somewhat formerly rejected, and by rejection brought into oblivion, as if the multitude, or the wisest for the multitude's sake, were not ready to give passage rather to that which is popular and superficial than to that which is substantial and profound. For the truth is, that time seemeth to be of the nature of a river or stream, which carrieth down to us that which is light and blown up, and sinketh and drowneth that which is weighty and solid. 4. Another error, of a diverse nature from all the former, is the over-early and peremptory reduction of knowledge into arts and methods, from which time commonly sciences receive small or no augmentation. But as young men, when they knit and shape perfectly, do seldom grow to a further stature, so knowledge, while it is in aphorisms and observations, it is in growth, but when it once is comprehended in exact methods, it may, perchance, be further polished and illustrate and accommodated for use and practice, but it increaseth no more in bulk and substance. 5. Another error which doth succeed, that which we last mentioned, is, that after the distribution of particular arts and sciences, men have abandoned universality or philosophia prima, which cannot but cease and stop all progression. For no perfect discovery can be made upon a flat or a level, neither is it possible to discover the more remote and deeper parts of any science if you stand but upon the level of the same science, and ascend not to a higher science. 6. Another error hath proceeded from too great a reverence, and a kind of adoration of the mind and understanding of man, by means whereof men have withdrawn themselves too much from the contemplation of nature and the observations of experience, and have tumbled up and down in their own reason and conceits. Upon these intellectualists, which are notwithstanding commonly taken for the most sublime and divine philosophers, Heraclitus gave a just censure, saying men sought truth in their own little worlds, and not in the great and common world. For they disdain to spell, and so by degrees to read in the volume of God's works, and contrariwise by continual meditation and agitation of wit do urge, and, as it were, invocate their own spirits to divine and give oracles unto them, whereby they are deservedly deluded. 7. Another error that hath some connection with this latter is, that men have used to infect their meditations, opinions and doctrines with some conceits which they have most admired, or some sciences which they have most applied, and given all things else a tincture according to them, utterly untrue and improper. So hath Plato intermingled his philosophy with theology, and Aristotle with logic. And the second school of Plato, Proclus and the rest, with the mathematics, for these were the arts which had a kind of primogeniture with them severally. So have the alchemists made a philosophy out of a few experiments of the furnace, and Gilbertus our countryman hath made a philosophy out of the observations of a lodestone. So Cicero, when reciting the several opinions of the nature of the soul, he found a musician that held the soul was but a harmony. Saith pleasantly, hic ab art sua non recessit, and c. But of these conceits Aristotle speaketh seriously and wisely when he saith, qui respicunt ad pauca de facile pronunciant. 8. Another error is an impatience of doubt, and haste to assertion without due and mature suspension of judgment. For the two ways of contemplation are not unlike the two ways of action commonly spoken of by the ancients, the one plain and smooth in the beginning, and in the end impassable, the other rough and troublesome in the entrance, but after a while fair and even. So it is in contemplation. If a man will begin with certainties, he shall end in doubts. But if he will be content to begin with doubts, he shall end in certainties. 9. Another error is in the manner of the tradition and delivery of knowledge, which is for the most part magistral and peremptory, and not ingenuous and faithful, in a sort as may be soonest believed, and not easiest examined. It is true that in compendious treatises for practice that form is not to be disallowed, but in the true handling of knowledge men ought not to fall either on the one side into the vein of Velleius the Epicurean, nil tam metuns quam ni dubiter aliqua de revitalization, nor, on the other side, into Socrates, his ironical doubting of all things, but to propound things sincerely with more or less asseveration, as they stand in a man's own judgment proved more or less. 10 other errors there are in the scope that men propound to themselves, whereunto they bend their endeavors. For, whereas the more constant and devout kind of professors of any science ought to propound to themselves to make some additions to their science, they convert their labors to aspire to certain second prizes, as to be a profound interpreter or commentor, to be a sharp champion or defender, to be a methodical compounder or abridger, and so the patrimony of knowledge cometh to be sometimes improved, but seldom augmented. 11. But the greatest error of all the rest is the mistaking or misplacing of the last or furthest end of knowledge. For men have entered into a desire of learning and knowledge, sometimes upon a natural curiosity and inquisitive appetite, sometimes to entertain their minds with variety and delight, sometimes for ornament and reputation, and sometimes to enable them to victory of wit and contradiction, and most times for lucre and profession, and seldom sincerely to give a true account of their gift of reason to the benefit and use of men, as if there were sought in knowledge a couch whereupon to rest a searching and restless spirit, or a terrace for a wandering and variable mind to walk up and down with a fair prospect, or a tower of state for a proud mind to raise itself upon, or a fort or commanding ground for strife and contention, or a shop for profit or sale, and not a rich storehouse for the glory of the Creator and the relief of man's estate. This is that which will indeed dignify and exalt knowledge, if contemplation and action may be more nearly and straitly conjoined and united together than they have been, a conjunction like unto that of the two highest planets, Saturn, the planet of rest and contemplation, and Jupiter, the planet of civil society and action, howbeit I do not mean, when I speak of use and action, that end before mentioned of the applying of knowledge to lucre and profession. For I am not ignorant how much that diverteth and interrupteth the prosecution and advancement of knowledge. Like unto the golden ball thrown before Atalanta, which, while she goeth aside and stoopeth to take up, the race is hindered. Declinet cursus, aurunc volubile tollit. 1. Neither is my meaning, as was spoken of Socrates, to call philosophy down from heaven to converse upon the earth, that is, to leave natural philosophy aside, and to apply knowledge only to manners and policy. But as both heaven and earth do conspire and contribute to the use and benefit of man, so the end ought to be. From both philosophies to separate and reject vain speculations, and whatsoever is empty and void, and to preserve and augment whatsoever is solid and fruitful. That knowledge may not be as a courtesan, for pleasure and vanity only, or as a bondwoman, to acquire and gain to her master's use, but as a spouse for generation, fruit, and comfort. 12. Thus have I described and opened, as by a kind of dissection, those peccant humours, the principal of them, which have not only given impediment to the proficience of learning, but have given also occasion to the traducement thereof, wherein, if I have been too plain, it must be remembered. Fidelia vulnera amantes, sed dolosa oscula malignantes. This I think I have gained, that I ought to be the better believed in that which I shall say pertaining to commendation, because I have proceeded so freely in that which concerneth censure. And yet I have no purpose to enter into a laudative of learning, or to make a hymn to the Muses, though I am of opinion that it is long since their rites were duly celebrated. But my intent is, without varnish or amplification, justly to weigh the dignity of knowledge in the balance with other things, and to take the true value thereof by testimonies and arguments, divine and human. Bi 1. First, therefore, let us seek the dignity of knowledge in the archetype or first platform, which is in the attributes and acts of God, as far as they are revealed to man and may be observed with sobriety, wherein we may not seek it by the name of learning. For all learning is knowledge acquired, and all knowledge in God is original, and therefore we must look for it by another name, that of wisdom or sapience, as the Scriptures call it. To it is so, then, that in the work of the creation we see a double emanation of virtue from God, the one referring more properly to power, the other to wisdom, the one expressed in making the subsistence of the matter, and the other in disposing the beauty of the form. This being supposed, it is to be observed that for anything which appeareth in the history of the creation, the confused mass and matter of heaven and earth was made in a moment, and the order and disposition of that chaos or mass was the work of 6 days. Such a note of difference it pleased God to put upon the works of power and the works of wisdom, wherewith concurreth, that in the former it is not set down that God said, Let there be heaven and earth, as it is set down of the works following, but actually that God made heaven and earth, the one carrying the style of a manufacture, and the other of a law, decree, or counsel. 3. To proceed to that which is next in order from God to spirits, we find As far as credit is to be given to the celestial hierarchy of that supposed Dionysius, the senator of Athens, the first place or degree is given to the angels of love, which are termed seraphim, the second to the angels of light, which are termed cherubim, and the third, and so following places, to thrones, principalities, and the rest, which are all angels of power and ministry, so as this angels of knowledge and illumination are placed before the angels of office and domination. 4. To descend from spirits and intellectual forms to sensible and material forms, we read the first form that was created was light, which hath a relation and correspondence in nature, and corporal things to knowledge in spirits and incorporeal things. 5. So in the distribution of days we see the day wherein God did rest and contemplate his own works was blessed above all the days wherein he did effect and accomplish them. 6. After the creation was finished, it is set down unto us that man was placed in the garden to work therein, which work, so appointed to him, could be no other than work of contemplation, that is, when the end of work is but for exercise and experiment, not for necessity, for there being then no reluctation of the creature, nor sweat of the brow, man's employment must of consequence have been matter of delight in the experiment, and not matter of labor for the use. Again, the first acts which man performed in paradise consisted of the two summary parts of knowledge, the view of creatures, and the imposition of names. As for the knowledge which induced the fall, it was, as was touched before, not the natural knowledge of creatures, but the moral knowledge of good and evil, wherein the supposition was, that God's commandments or prohibitions were not the originals of good and evil, but that they had other beginnings which man aspired to know, to the end to make a total defection from God, and to depend wholly upon himself. 7. To pass on, in the first event or occurrence after the fall of man, we see as the Scriptures have infinite mysteries, not violating at all the truth of this story or letter and image of the two estates, the contemplative state and the active state, figured in the two persons of Abel and Cain, and in the two simplest and most primitive trades of life, that of the shepherd who, by reason of his leisure, rest in a place, and lying in view of heaven, is a lively image of a contemplative life, and that of the husbandman, where we see again the favor and election of God went to the shepherd, and not to the tiller of the ground. 8. So in the age before the flood, the holy records within those few memorials which are there entered and registered have vouchsafed to mention and honor the name of the inventors and authors of music and works in metal. In the age after the flood, the first great judgment of God upon the ambition of man was the confusion of tongues, whereby the open trade and intercourse of learning and knowledge was chiefly embarred. 9. To descend to Moses the lawgiver, and God's first pen, he is adorned by the Scriptures with this addition and commendation, that he was seen in all the learning of the Egyptians, which nation we know was one of the most ancient schools of the world, for so Plato brings in the Egyptian priest saying unto Solon, You Grecians are ever children, you have no knowledge of antiquity, nor antiquity of knowledge. Take a view of the ceremonial law of Moses, you shall find, besides the prefiguration of Christ, the badge or difference of the people of God. the exercise and impression of obedience, and other divine uses and fruits thereof, that some of the most learned rabbins have travailed profitably and profoundly to observe, some of them a natural, some of them a moral sense, or reduction of many of the ceremonies and ordinances. In the law of the leprosy, where it is said, if the whiteness have overspread the flesh, the patient may pass abroad for clean. But if there be any whole flesh remaining, he is to be shut up for unclean. One of them noteth a principle of nature, that putrefaction is more contagious before maturity than after, and another noteth a position of moral philosophy, that men abandoned to vice do not so much corrupt manners, as those that are half good and half evil. So in this and very many other places in that law there is to be found, besides the theological sense, much aspersion of philosophy. Tend so likewise in that excellent hook of Job, if it be revolved with diligence, it will be found pregnant and swelling with natural philosophy, as for example, cosmography, and the roundness of the world. Qui extendit aquilonum super vacuum, et appendit terram super nihilum, wherein the pensileness of the earth, the pole of the north, and the finiteness or convexity of heaven are manifestly touched. So again, matter of astronomy, spiritus ejus ornavit calos, et obstetricante manu ejus eductus est coluber tortuosus. And in another place, nunquid conjunger veilbus mecantes stellas Pleiades, aut gyrum arcturi potris disapere, where the fixing of the stars, ever standing at equal distance, is with great elegancy noted. And in another place, qui facit arcturum, et Oriona, et Hyades, et interiora Austri, where again he takes knowledge of the depression of the southern pole, calling it the secrets of the south, because the southern stars were in that climate unseen. Matter of generation, anen sicut lac mulsisti me, et sicut cassium coagulasti me, and c. Matter of minerals, habit argentum venarum suarum principia, et auro locus est in quo conflatur, ferrum de terratolatur, et lapis solutus calor in ease vertitur, and so forwards in that chapter. 11. So likewise in the person of Solomon the king, we see the gift or endowment of wisdom and learning, both in Solomon's petition and in God's assent thereunto, preferred before all other terrene and temporal felicity, by virtue of which grant or donative of God Solomon became enabled not only to write those excellent parables or aphorisms concerning divine and moral philosophy, but also to compile a natural history of all verdure, from the cedar upon the mountain to the moss upon the wall, which is but a rudiment between putrefaction and an herb, and also of all things that breathe or move. Nay, the same Solomon the king, although he excelled in the glory of treasure and magnificent buildings, of shipping and navigation, of service and attendance, of fame and renown, and the like, yet he maketh no claim to any of those glories, but only to the glory of inquisition of truth. For so he saith expressly, the glory of God is to conceal a thing, but the glory of the king is to find it out, as if, according to the innocent play of children, the divine majesty took delight to hide his works, to the end to have them found out, and as if kings could not obtain a greater honor than to be God's playfellows in that game. Considering the great commandment of wits and means, whereby nothing needeth to be hidden from them. 12. Neither did the dispensation of God vary in the times after our Saviour came into the world. For our Saviour himself did first show his power to subdue ignorance, by his conference with the priests and doctors of the law, before he showed his power to subdue nature by his miracles. And the coming of this Holy Spirit was chiefly figured and expressed in the similitude and gift of tongues, which are but vehicula scientiae. 13. So in the election of those instruments, which it pleased God to use for the plantation of the faith, notwithstanding that at the first he did employ persons altogether unlearned, otherwise than by inspiration, more evidently to declare his immediate working, and to abase all human wisdom or knowledge. Yet, nevertheless, that counsel of his was no sooner performed, but in the next vicissitude and succession he did send his divine truth into the world, waited on with other learnings, as with servants or handmaids, for so we see St. Paul, who was only learned amongst the apostles, had his pen most used in the scriptures of the New Testament. 14. So again we find that many of the ancient bishops and fathers of the Church were excellently read and studied in all the learning of this heathen, insomuch that the edict of the Emperor Julianus, whereby it was interdicted unto Christians to be admitted into schools, lectures, or exercises of learning, was esteemed and accounted a more pernicious engine and machination against the Christian faith than were all the sanguinary prosecutions of his predecessors. Neither could the emulation and jealousy of Gregory, the first of that name, Bishop of Rome, ever obtain the opinion of piety or devotion, but contrariwise received the censure of humor, malignity, and pusillanimity, even amongst holy men, in that he designed to obliterate and extinguish the memory of heathen antiquity and authors. But contrariwise it was the Christian Church, which, amidst the inundations of the Scythians on the one side from the northwest, and the Saracens from the east, did preserve in the sacred lap and bosom thereof the precious relics even of heathen learning, which otherwise had been extinguished, as if no such thing had ever been. 15. And we see before our eyes that in the age of ourselves and our fathers, when it pleased God to call the Church of Rome to account for their degenerate manners and ceremonies, and sundry doctrines obnoxious and framed to uphold the same abuses, at one and the same time, it was ordained by the divine providence that there should attend withal a renovation and new spring of all other knowledges. And on the other side we see the Jesuits, who partly in themselves, and partly by the emulation and provocation of their example, have much quickened and strengthened the state of learning. We see, I say, what notable service and reparation they have done to the Roman See. 16. Wherefore, to conclude this part, let it be observed that there be two principal duties and services, besides ornament and illustration, which philosophy and human learning do perform to faith and religion. The one, because they are an effectual inducement to the exaltation of the glory of God. For as the Psalms and other scriptures do often invite us to consider and magnify the great and wonderful works of God, so if we should rest only in the contemplation of the exterior of them, as they first offer themselves to our senses, We should do a like injury unto the majesty of God, as if we should judge or construe of the store of some excellent jeweller by that only which is set out toward the street in his shop. The other, because they minister a singular help and preservative against unbelief and error. For our Saviour saith, You err, not knowing the Scriptures, nor the power of God, laying before us 2 books or volumes to study. If we will be secured from error, first the Scriptures, revealing the will of God, and then the creatures expressing his power, whereof the latter is a key unto the former, not only opening our understanding to conceive the true sense of the Scriptures by the general notions of reason and rules of speech, but chiefly opening our belief, in drawing us into a due meditation of the omnipotency of God, which is chiefly signed and engraven upon his works. Thus much therefore for divine testimony and evidence concerning the true dignity and value of learning. Romans 7:1. As for human proofs, it is so large a field, as in a discourse of this nature and brevity it is fit rather to use choice of those things which we shall produce, than to embrace the variety of them. First, therefore, in the degrees of human honor amongst the heathen, it was the highest to obtain to a veneration and adoration as a god. This unto the Christians is as the forbidden fruit. But we speak now separately of human testimony, according to which that which the Grecians call apotheosis, and the Latins relatio inter divos, was the supreme honor which man could attribute unto man, specially when it was given, not by a formal decree or act of state, as it was used among the Roman emperors, but by an inward assent and belief, which honor, being so high, had also a degree or middle term, for there were reckoned above human honors heroical and divine, in the attribution and distribution of which honors we see antiquity made this difference, that whereas founders and uniters of states and cities, lawgivers, extirpers of tyrants, fathers of the people, and other eminent persons in civil merit, were honored but with the titles of worthies or demigods, such as were Hercules, Theseus, Midas, Romulus, and the like on the other side, such as were inventors and authors of new arts, endowments, and commodities towards man's life, were ever consecrated amongst the gods themselves, as was Ceres, Bacchus, Mercurius, Apollo, and others, and justly, for the merit of the former is confined within the circle of an age or a nation, and is like fruitful showers, which though they be profitable and good, yet serve but for that season, and for a latitude of ground where they fall, but the other is, indeed, like the benefits of heaven, which are permanent and universal. The former again is mixed with strife and perturbation, but the latter hath the true character of divine presence, coming in or leni, without noise or agitation. To neither is certainly that other merit of learning, in repressing the inconveniences which grow from man to man, much inferior to the former, of relieving the necessities which arise from nature, which merit was lively set forth by the ancients in that feigned relation of Orpheus' theatre, where all beasts and birds assembled, and, forgetting their several appetites, some of prey, some of game, some of quarrel, stood all sociably together, listening unto the airs and accords of the harp, the sound whereof no sooner ceased, or was drowned by some louder noise, but every beast returned to his own nature, wherein is aptly described the nature and condition of men, who are full of savage and unreclaimed desires, of profit, of lust, of revenge, which as long as they give ear to precepts, to laws, to religion, sweetly touched with eloquence and persuasion of books, of sermons, of harangues, so long is society and peace maintained. But if these instruments be silent, or that sedition and tumult make them not audible, all things dissolve into anarchy and confusion. 3. But this appeareth more manifestly when kings themselves, or persons of authority under them, or other governors in commonwealths and popular estates, are endued with learning. For although he might be thought partial to his own profession, that said then should people and estates be happy when either kings were philosophers, or philosophers kings, yet so much is verified by experience, that under learned princes and governors there have been ever the best times. For howsoever kings may have their imperfections in their passions and customs, yet, if they be illuminate by learning, they have those notions of religion, policy, and morality, which do preserve them and refrain them from all ruinous and peremptory errors and excesses, whispering evermore in their ears, when counsellors and servants stand mute and silent, and senators or counsellors, likewise, which be learned, to proceed upon more safe and substantial principles, and counsellors which are only men of experience, the one sort keeping dangers afar off, whereas the other discover them not till they come near hand, and then trust to the agility of their wit to ward or avoid them. For which felicity of times under learned princes, to keep still the law of brevity, by using the most eminent and selected examples, doth best appear in the age which passed from the death of Domitianus the emperor until the reign of Commodus, comprehending a succession of 6 princes, all learned, or singular favourers and advancers of learning, which age for temporal respects was the most happy and flourishing, that ever the Roman Empire, which then was a model of the world, enjoyed a matter revealed and prefigured unto Domitian in a dream the night before he was slain, for he thought there was grown behind upon his shoulders a neck and a head of gold, which came accordingly to pass in those golden times which succeeded, of which princes we will make some commemoration, wherein, although the matter will be vulgar, and may be thought fitter for a declamation than agreeable to a treatise infolded as this is, yet, because it is pertinent to the point in hand, nec semper arcum tendit Apollo, and to name them only were too naked and cursory, I will not omit it altogether. The first was Nerva, the excellent temper of whose government is by a glance in Cornelius Tacitus touched to the life, postquam divis nerva res alium in sociabiles misquisset, imperium et libertatem, and in token of his learning, the last act of his short reign left to memory was a missive to his adopted son, Trajan, proceeding upon some inward discontent at the ingratitude of the times, comprehended in a verse of Homer's, Telles Phoebe, tuis lacrimas ulcicere nostras. 5. Trajan, who succeeded, was for his person not learned. But, if we will hearken to the speech of our Saviour, that saith, he that receiveth a prophet in the name of a prophet shall have a prophet's reward, he deserveth to be placed amongst the most learned princes, for there was not a greater admirer of learning or benefactor of learning, a founder of famous libraries, a perpetual advancer of learned men to office, and familiar converser with learned professors and preceptors who were noted to have then most credit in court. On the other side, how much Trajan's virtue and government was admired and renowned, surely no testimony of grave and faithful history doth more lively set forth than that legend tale of Gregorius Magnum, Bishop of Rome, who was noted for the extreme envy he bare towards all heathen excellency. And yet he is reported, out of the love and estimation of Trajan's moral virtues, to have made unto God passionate and fervent prayers for the delivery of his soul out of hell, and to have obtained it, with a caveat that he should make no more such petitions. In this prince's time also the persecutions against the Christians received intermission upon the certificate of Plinius Secundus, a man of excellent learning and by Trajan advanced. 6. Adrian, his successor, was the most curious man that lived, and the most universal inquirer, insomuch as it was noted for an error in his mind that he desired to comprehend all things, and not to reserve himself for the worthiest things, falling into the like humor that was long before noted in Philip of Macedon, who, when he would needs overrule and put down an excellent musician in an argument touching music, was well answered by him again, God forbid. Sir, saith he, that your fortune should be so bad as to know these things better than I. It pleased God likewise to use the curiosity of this emperor as an inducement to the peace of his church in those days. For having Christ in veneration, not as a God or Saviour, but as a wonder or novelty, and having his picture in his gallery matched with Apollonius, with whom in his vain imagination he thought it had some conformity, yet it served the turn to allay the bitter hatred of those times against the Christian name, so as the Church had peace during his time, and for his government civil, although he did not attain to that of Trajan's in glory of arms or perfection of justice. Yet in deserving of the weal of the subject he did exceed him. For Trajan erected many famous monuments and buildings, insomuch as Constantine the Great in emulation was wont to call him Parieteria, wallflower, because his name was upon so many walls, but his buildings and works were more of glory and triumph than use and necessity. But Adrian spent his whole reign, which was peaceable, in a perambulation or survey of the Roman Empire, giving order and making assignation where he went for re-edifying of cities, towns and forts decayed, and for cutting of rivers and streams, and for making bridges and passages, and for policing of cities and commonalties with new ordinances and constitutions, and granting new franchises and incorporations, so that his whole time was a very restoration of all the lapses and decays of former times. 7. Antoninus Pius, who succeeded him, was a prince excellently learned, and had the patient and subtle wit of a schoolman, insomuch as in common speech which leaves no virtue untaxed he was called Simene Sector, a carver or a divider of common seed, which is one of the least seeds. Such a patience he had, and settled spirit to enter into the least and most exact differences of causes, a fruit no doubt of the exceeding tranquillity and serenity of his mind, which being no ways charged or encumbered, either with fears, remorses, or scruples, but having been noted for a man of the purest goodness, without all fiction or affectation, that hath reigned or lived, made his mind continually present and entire. He likewise approached a degree nearer unto Christianity, and became, as Agrippa said unto St. Paul, half a Christian, holding their religion and law in good opinion, and not only ceasing persecution, but giving way to the advancement of Christians. 5. There succeeded him the first Divi Fraters, the two adoptive brethren Lucius Commodus Verus, son to Aelius Verus, who delighted much in the softer kind of learning, and was wont to call the poet Martial his Virgil, and Marcus Aurelius Antoninus, whereof the latter, who obscured his colleague, and survived him long, was named the philosopher, who, as he excelled all the rest in learning, so he excelled them likewise in perfection of all royal virtues. Insomuch as Julianus the emperor, in his book entitled Cerceres, being as a pasquil or satire to deride all his predecessors, feigned that they were all invited to a banquet of the gods, and Silenus the jester sat at the nether end of the table, and bestowed a scoff on everyone as they came in. But when Marcus Philosophus came in, Silenus was gravelled and out of countenance, not knowing where to carp at him. Save at the last, he gave a glance at his patience towards his wife. And the virtue of this prince, continued with that of his predecessor, made the name of Antoninus so sacred in the world, that though it were extremely dishonored in Commodus Caracalla and Heliogabalus, who all bear the name, yet, when Alexander Severus refused the name because he was a stranger to the family, the Senate with one acclamation said, Quamodo Augustus sicut Antoninus. In such renown and veneration was the name of these two princes in those days, that they would have had it as a perpetual addition in all the emperor's style. In this emperor's time also the church for the most part was in peace, so as in this sequence of 6 princes we do see the blessed effects of learning in sovereignty, painted forth in the greatest table of the world. 9. But for a tablet or picture of smaller volume, not presuming to speak of your majesty that live. In my judgment the most excellent is that of Queen Elizabeth, your immediate predecessor in this part of Britain. A prince that, if Plutarch were now alive to write lives by parallels, would trouble him, I think, to find for her a parallel amongst women. This lady was endued with learning in her sex singular, and rare even amongst masculine princes, whether we speak of learning, of language, or of science, modern or ancient, divinity or humanity, and unto the very last year of her life she accustomed to appoint set hours for reading. Scarcely any young student in a university more daily or more duly. As for her government, I assure myself I shall not exceed if I do affirm that this part of the island never had 45 years of better times. And yet not through the calmness of the season, but through the wisdom of her regiment. For if there be considered of the one side, the truth of religion established, the constant peace and security, the good administration of justice, the temperate use of the prerogative, not slackened, nor much strained, the flourishing state of learning, sortable to so excellent a patroness, the convenient estate of wealth and means, both of crown and subject, the habit of obedience, and the moderation of discontents, and there be considered on the other side the differences of religion, the troubles of neighbor countries, the ambition of Spain and opposition of Rome, and then that she was solitary and of herself. These things, I say, considered, as I could not have chosen an instance so recent and so proper, so I suppose I could not have chosen one more remarkable or eminent to the purpose now in hand, which is concerning the conjunction of learning in the prince with felicity in the people. 10. Neither hath learning an influence and operation only upon civil merit and moral virtue, and the arts or temperature of peace and peaceable government, but likewise it hath no less power and efficacy in enablement towards martial and military virtue and prowess, as may be notably represented in the examples of Alexander the Great and Caesar the dictator mentioned before. But now in fit place to be resumed, of whose virtues and acts in war there needs no note or recital, having been the wonders of time in that kind, but of their affections towards learning and perfections in learning it is pertinent to say somewhat. 11. Alexander was bred and taught under Aristotle, the great philosopher, who dedicated divers of his books of philosophy unto him. He was attended with Callisthenes and divers other learned persons, that followed him in camp. What price and estimation he had learning in doth notably appear in these three particulars. First, in the envy he used to express that he bare towards Achilles. In this, that he had so good a trumpet of his praises as Homer's verses. Secondly, in the judgment or solution he gave touching that precious cabinet of Darius, which was found among his jewels, whereof question was made what thing was worthy to be put into it, and he gave his opinion for Homer's works. Thirdly, in his letter to Aristotle, after he had set forth his books of nature, wherein he expostulатeth with him for publishing the secrets or mysteries of philosophy, and gave him to understand that himself esteemed it more to excel other men in learning and knowledge than in power and empire. And what use he had of learning doth appear, or rather shine, in all his speeches and answers, being full of science and use of science, and that in all variety. 12. And herein again it may seem a thing scholastical, and somewhat idle to recite things that every man knoweth. But yet, since the argument I handle leadeth me thereunto, I am glad that men shall perceive I am as willing to flatter if they will so call it an Alexander, or a Caesar, or an Antoninus, that are dead many hundred years since, as any that now live. For it is the displaying of the glory of learning in sovereignty that I propound to myself, and not a humor of declaiming in any man's praises. Observe, then, the speech he used of Diogenes, and see if it tend not to the true state of one of the greatest questions of moral philosophy, whether the enjoying of outward things, or the contemning of them, be the greatest happiness. For when he saw Diogenes so perfectly contented with so little, he said to those that mocked at his condition, were I not Alexander, I would wish to be Diogenes. But Seneca inverteth it, and saith, plus erat, quod hic nolit acciper, quam quod ille possit dare. There were more things which Diogenes would have refused than those were which Alexander could have given or enjoyed. 13. Observe, again, that speech which was usual with him, that he felt his mortality chiefly in two things, sleep and lust, and see if it were not a speech extracted out of the depth of natural philosophy, and liker to have come out of the mouth of Aristotle or Democritus than from Alexander. 14c. Again, that speech of humanity and poesy, when, upon the bleeding of his wounds, he called unto him one of his flatterers, that was wont to ascribe to him divine honor, and said, Look, this is very blood. This is not such a liquor as Homer speaketh of, which ran from Venus' hand, when it was pierced by Dion's. 15. See likewise his readiness in reprehension of logic in the speech he used to Cassander, upon a complaint that was made against his father Antipater. For when Alexander happened to say, Do you think these men would have come from so far to complain except they had just cause of grief? And Cassander answered, Yea, that was the matter, because they thought they should not be disproved, said Alexander, laughing. See the subtleties of Aristotle, to take a matter both ways pro et contra, and c. 16. But note, again, how well he could use the same art which he reprehended to serve his own humor, when bearing a secret grudge to Callisthenes, because he was against the new ceremony of his adoration, feasting one night, where the same Callisthenes was at the table. It was moved by some after supper, for entertainment's sake, that Callisthenes, who was an eloquent man, might speak of some theme or purpose at his own choice, which Callisthenes did, choosing the praise of the Macedonian nation for his discourse, and performing the same with so good manner as the hearers were much ravished, whereupon Alexander, nothing pleased, said, It was easy to be eloquent upon so good a subject, but, saith he, turn your style, and let us hear what you can say against us. Which Callisthenes presently undertook, and did with that sting and life, that Alexander interrupted him, and said, The goodness of the cause made him eloquent before, and despite made him eloquent then again. 17. Consider further, for tropes of rhetoric, that excellent use of a metaphor or translation, wherewith he taxeth Antipater, who was an imperious and tyrannous governor, for when one of Antipater's friends commended him to Alexander for his moderation, that he did not degenerate as his other lieutenants did into the Persian pride, in uses of purple, but kept the ancient habit of Macedon. Of black, true, saith Alexander, but Antipater is all purple within. Or that other, when Parmenio came to him in the plain of Arbela, and showed him the innumerable multitude of his enemies, specially as they appeared by the infinite number of lights, as it had been a new firmament of stars, and thereupon advised him to assail them by night. Whereupon he answered, that he would not steal the victory. 18. For matter of policy, weigh that significant distinction, so much in all ages embraced, that he made between his two friends Hephaestion and Craterus, when he said that the one loved Alexander, and the other loved the king, describing the principal difference of princes' best servants, that some in affection love their person, and other in duty love their crown. 19. Weigh also that excellent taxation of an error, ordinary with counsellors of princes, that they counsel their masters according to the model of their own mind and fortune, and not of their masters. When upon Darius' great offers Parmenio had said, Surely I would accept these offers were I as Alexander. Saith Alexander, so would I were I as Parmenio. 20. Lastly, weigh that quick and acute reply which he made when he gave so large gifts to his friends and servants, and was asked what he did reserve for himself, and he answered, hope. Weigh, I say, whether he had not cast up his account aright, because hope must be the portion of all that resolve upon great enterprises. For this was Caesar's portion when he went first into Gaul, his estate being then utterly overthrown with largesses. And this was likewise the portion of that noble prince, howsoever transported with ambition, Henry Duke of Guise, of whom it was usually said that he was the greatest usurer in France, because he had turned all his estate into obligations. 21. To conclude, therefore, as certain critics are used to say hyperbolically, that if all sciences were lost they might be found in Virgil, so certainly this may be said truly. There are the prints and footsteps of learning in those few speeches which are reported of this prince,